Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are discussing Chapter 7 of Basic Income, a Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy by Philippe von Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght. And the title of the chapter this week is Politically Achievable, Civil Society, Parties, and the Backdoor. So in the question of kind of the politics of basic income, how close are we to getting there, and what needs to happen to kind of get people on board and to get policymakers on board with implementing something like a basic income or actually implementing a basic income. And this chapter kind of goes through different political interest groups and talks about a little bit of the history of how they've responded to the idea of basic income, or whether they've supported it or not, and that kind of thing. So we talk about employers, the precariat, women, socialists, liberals, Greens, Christians. Yeah, I guess those are the main groups that they go over in this, and they talk about whether basic income would make sense to integrate with any of those kind of political ideologies. Oh, and labor unions as well. That was actually the first one, which I kind of skipped. So yeah, let's get into a quote from this chapter. Or I just want to say first that I think, like, basic income is not going to happen without political support. It's just not going to happen. But it's also going to be hard to get enough political support if people don't really know what they're asking for. So if you're thinking of basic income as like a more efficient form of safety net, or the answer to robots taking jobs or something like that, it's going to be a lot trickier to get people behind basic income politically than if you're just thinking of it as like, oh, we need a mechanism for distributing money to people that's as efficient as possible. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on the intellectual side that the political side of kind of the basic income community could really benefit from. And in terms of these different groups, I think it's always a little tricky to integrate basic income into an existing ideology. And they talk about this in the chapter a little bit, that a lot of these ideologies are really kind of connected to labor and the idea that people should work. So it's not an easy, because there's a lot of things that need to change. There's kind of a lot of moving parts, and we can move a little bit politically. I think there's been a lot of progress politically, even since this book was written. This is before Andrew Yang, right? But it's also, there's a limit to how far we can go with that. So we move a little bit intellectually, we move a little bit politically. And then there's this idea of kind of sneaking in the back door. At the end of the chapter, they talk about a participation income, which is ostensibly you're paying people for kind of contributing to society, but then you broaden the definition of contributing to society so much that it really just goes to everyone, and it's really basic income. So they call that like sneaking in the back door. But there are things that we can do that get us closer to basic income that people might like, and without actually deciding to do it, we might be moving. It might be possible to move in that direction. So here we go. Here's the first quote. Whoops. Unlike economic sustainability, political feasibility must not be treated as a parameter to be taken as a given. It is something that can be shaped by opinion, and it is indeed our job to help shape. So this is the idea that basic income, or a certain level of basic income, is either economically sustainable or it's not. But political feasibility can change. You can shift the Overton window, and people can change how they feel, and society can change how they feel about something like this. So that's basically kind of what that quote is getting at here, and that's what this chapter is about. So even though they go over a lot of history of people being against basic income for this reason or that reason, it doesn't necessarily have to stay that way. So let's go to the next one. So this is related to some of the other stuff we've talked about recently. The contours of the politically feasible are set by our values no less than by our interests, by our moral attractions and repulsions, no less than by the balance of power, by arguments about what is right, no less than by calculations of what would best satisfy our greed. So, you know, there's kind of in general the idea of, you know, kind of what we care about in general, what we want for society. And then, so I think the distinction they're drawing is like what we want for ourselves as individuals, and then kind of what we want for society as a whole. In an ideal world, these things line up with each other and you're fighting for both at the same time. I think if you're thinking about basic income the way I think about it, that you just want, you know, your money distribution mechanism to work properly, then that serves both, right? You want a properly functioning economy that's good for every interest group, right? If you have a broken economy, that there might be some people who benefit in specific ways. But even then, I think most people want to live, they don't want to be walking around a city that has poverty, and they don't want to be living in a world where, you know, people are unable to access resources and, you know, or, you know, imagine what the COVID pandemic would have been like if we'd had a global basic income and the resources to really, you know, distribute the vaccines to everyone efficiently. Now, maybe some of the reason people aren't getting vaccines is for other stuff, but there's also, you know, just being able to have the resources. Yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, when your money system is broken, a lot of other things break, and we'd be able to respond better to a lot of different adverse events if we had a basic income in place. Now, in terms of getting people on board politically, I think a lot of the arguments that people use for basic income are kind of targeted at specific interests, like, oh, you know, people will actually, you know, work more if there's a basic income, or, you know, it gives workers more bargaining power. It actually does this thing that you've been fighting for, that kind of thing. I think if you have these specific targeted arguments, then you lose the generality, and you lose maybe some potential for broader appeal. So I think that's something we probably want to pay attention to. And I think the politics of basic income get a lot easier if more people in general, but also advocates of basic income, understand the mechanics of basic income, if they really know what it does and what they're actually asking for. So I think, you know, that's kind of where I like to focus. So let's go to the next one here. Yeah, so Joan says in the chat that it seems like all those kind of targeted interests in basic income are cumulative, and they are in a sense, right? So there's the sense in which basic income solves all these different problems because we live in a world with a broken money distribution system, and that causes a lot of different problems, which would be solved by not having the money distribution system be broken. But when you target one interest or one interest group, one kind of political group, then you might be alienating people who are not part of that group. So that's a potential problem as well. So even though you're directing your arguments in one direction at a specific group of people, other people who don't share that ideology might look at what you're saying and say, well, wait a minute, I don't want that, or something like that. So if you talk about, for example, you know, just the fact that, oh, with a basic income, we don't need, you know, necessarily all these safety net programs and welfare programs. People will be like, well, wait a minute, you know, maybe the libertarian small government people will be like, oh yeah, that's actually a good argument for basic income. And then other people will be like, well, I don't like the libertarians, and I don't like that, I don't like the idea of, you know, kind of taking this thing away from people, even if kind of fundamentally what you're doing is you're fixing the problem that these other programs were designed as band-aids for in the first place. It doesn't, you know, you're only giving like a part of the picture, and then people interpret it very differently. And then my mom says, or Joan is my mom, and she says, that's why a lot of targeted interests are desirable. And I would say that the answer to that is actually, you'd think it might be, you'd think you'd want to just create as big of a list as possible so everyone can find something. But what ends up happening is people look for the things they disagree with, not the things they agree with. So what you're doing is you're creating a greater surface area for attack. There's more kind of weak points that people can pick at. The more arguments you make, the weaker your argument becomes. That's generally kind of been my experience. And it's also evidence that you don't have a single strong argument, right? Like if you're coming up with all these different, oh, it does this and this and this and this, it sounds like you're trying to compensate for something, like you're trying to make up for some deficiency, or it's just kind of you haven't really thought it through or something like that. And I think, basic income, it solves one simple fundamental problem, right? It allows the economy to distribute money efficiently so people can access the market. And if you start going through, kind of all these different things, and we see this a lot in basic income, and then for the supporters of basic income, it gets them excited. Oh yeah, it does that too. It does that. Oh yeah. We'll get really excited about it. But then the opponents of basic income, it just gives them more material to work with, right? So keep it simple in general. There's an essay by Paul Graham entitled, you can find it on the internet. It's entitled "Keep Your Identity Small." So if you really care about something, you have to kind of focus on that one thing, and then don't talk about other things that you have opinions on or anything, right? You really focus on kind of the one thing. And I think kind of this keeping it simple approach is really what's going to cut through a lot of the noise surrounding basic income. And right now we are not keeping it simple. And this book certainly does not keep it simple. But even in the moments where they do try to simplify it and cut through the noise, they're talking about freedom and justice, which I think is only a small part of the picture, right? When you break money, you break freedom and you break justice. So yeah, it helps freedom and justice. But again, that's just a side effect of the fact that this other thing is broken. So let's see. Oh yeah, I was about to share another one. Apart from the uncertainty of the effects attributed to the proposal, the reason that John Elster believes that basic income completely lacks the potential for being rooted in a social movement is precisely that it is ethically objectionable. Moreover, he writes, the proposal goes against a widely accepted notion of justice. It is unfair for able-bodied people to live off the labor of others. Most workers would, correctly in my opinion, see the proposal as a recipe for the exploitation of the industrious by the lazy. So this is an objection that we often hear from the left, that basic income allows the lazy to profit from the work of others. It's not wrong. The question is whether that's a bad thing. People are working because they're being paid. It's not like there's a class of people that's exploiting another class or something like that. Everybody's getting the basic income, and then some people are choosing to work. It's that some people prefer to do the work in exchange for extra benefit, while other people prefer to enjoy their leisure time. So yes, this is true. But if you are kind of staunch, if your ideology is that you're staunchly against, people benefiting from the work of others without kind of contributing something back, then you, on the face of it, are going to be like, well, that's what basic income does, therefore it's bad. And I've talked to Marxists like this. Marxists always imagined that the laborers are the poor and that the lazy people are the rich. And then there are, often people on the right who imagine that the people doing all the important hard work are like the business owners and, the rich people, they got rich because they worked hard, that kind of thing. And then lazy people are the poor people, right? But both sides are saying that the actual work is being taken advantage of by the lazy. They're both saying that. They're just disagreeing about which side is the lazy side and which side is the working side. And really, it doesn't matter that much. What matters is that enough work is being done. There's enough incentive in the market for the necessary amount of labor. And what matters is that people have optimal access to that. People in general, not just the people doing the work. Now, you could imagine a world where people would, everyone would only want to produce, consume in proportion to what they produce. But the reality is that there are people who are happy to produce a lot more than they consume. There are businesses that are happy to keep pumping out goods and services and sucking up money and accumulating, that profit in the form of money. And that's something that everyone else can benefit from if they have the money to spend to buy the products. So the question is, how do you distribute that money? And we already have mechanisms for doing that. They're just, not efficient and not fully functional. They've got problems, right? And basic income is an alternative to those mechanisms, overstimulating the financial sector to create jobs and push money to people in that way that actually doesn't even get to everyone, but is enough to kind of keep things limping along. We can do better than that. So yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
There's one thing that you said that I want to sort of add to, which is about businesses sort of soaking up money and being happy to soak up money. And I want to point out that for the most part, businesses they don't really soak up money. Businesses usually actually try to keep the amount of cash in the business to a relative minimum, just enough to meet cash flow purposes, so that they don't run out. The same way individuals have to do the same thing. What they usually do is, with most of their money, is they try to invest it. It goes into assets. It goes into investment of some type, building factories, etc. And so what's being accumulated is not money by businesses, but it's assets.
Yeah. So you're not disagreeing with me. You're just defining money more narrowly than I am. Like, I'm including in money, financial assets and other forms of wealth that businesses would want to accumulate. Generally, if you're saving, right, you want to save in the form of something that's going to provide you a good return.
Right, but even if we define money to include financial assets, such as say stocks and bonds, like even that, businesses don't tend to accumulate that. They accumulate the real real assets of some type. It goes
like
to money.
real productive assets. I mean, I think it depends on the business, and I think sometimes these real assets are not necessarily producing something for the benefit of ordinary consumers, because that's not always where the most money is. So you have these businesses kind of providing services to each other, and there's kind of this buildup of interdependent business activity and stuff like that. If you have a money distribution mechanism like basic income, it gets the businesses more oriented to, when they actually invest in real investment, to invest in capacity that'll benefit the people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The financial assets, those are, whether it's equity or bonds, it's a claim of some type of one entity, like the individual investor, on another entity, like the business. But I think the real key here is the underutilization. That the businesses, they don't hoard up monetary wealth or financial wealth. They build assets, but the problem with the whole system is that the assets, the capital, and also the labor, both are underutilized, because not enough income goes to the consumer worker to activate both the capital.
I mean, I think that's true to some extent. There's underutilization of capacity, and there's also one of the ways we could utilize capacity is in building more capacity, and we're also underutilizing that. Like, you're not going to build capacity if it's not going to get activated. You're not going to invest in new factories if people aren't going to buy the widgets that come out of them, that kind of thing. So I think, So I think I don't think underutilization is the key thing here. I think the key thing here is that the way we get people their money is broken, and then there are a lot of adverse effects of that, and underutilization can be part of that, and underinvestment in terms of real investment or investment that goes towards consumers can be part of that. And obviously, when we talk about businesses, businesses are owned by people. So there's businesses investing in real, capacity, like you were talking about. There's also businesses that are kind of buying back their own stocks to keep their stock prices up and stuff like that, because they can't, they don't. There's nothing really useful for them to do by way of real investment, but they want to keep their stock price up. There's a lot of stuff that is not happening that could be happening. That's a sign that something is not happening, right? They're just buying back their own stock.
It goes back to that argument that is kind of very persistent, where whether you're on the left or the right, everybody's sort of asking, well, where does the money come from? And then the right figures that you're trying to take it from people who are successful, and the left figures that you're gonna somehow end up taking it from the poor through a basic income. And the thing is that most of these people who are arguing in this manner, they don't realize that it is that through underutilization, there's just all this space of production that you could be having, that everybody could be having, and it's just simply not getting done for no benefit, for no trade-off. That it just simply you just could have a better economy, a better universe, and you just don't have it, just because because of all the stuff that we talk about, because of the lack of the basic income.
Yeah, I don't think the underutilization argument is the central argument for basic income. Certainly, it's one of the things that happens, right? Is that you end up in a situation with underutilization if you don't have a basic income. Just like you end up in a situation where people aren't as free as they could be, or like maybe you feel like it's not as fair as it could be, or something like that, right? You end up in a situation with poverty. But this is all kind of, again, it's we don't really need to talk about underutilization when we're talking about basic income. We can just talk about, well, how do you want people to get their money? And then if you show them the way that people get their money now, they're going to be like, well, that's just a broken system, right? You can just hand people their money directly instead. So certainly you can talk about underutilization, but I think that's missing the big picture, and it's getting into details that not everyone is really going to respond to well. This relates to what we were talking about before with targeted arguments. So, if you use an underutilization argument, then maybe someone who supports, degrowth or, environmentalism or something like that, they're going to be like, well, why would we want to utilize more resources, right? Why would we want maximum utilization, right? So I think, you get, it's another example of one of these kinds of arguments that is going to be appealing to some people and is going to be a red flag for other people. Whereas if you just make the argument that you need an efficient way of distributing money in such a way that it doesn't waste resources, right? Then green people and environmentalists can get behind that. Degrowthers can get behind that. Pro-growthers can get behind that, right? Nobody wants to waste resources arbitrarily, and that's what our current money distribution system does.
Right. Well, for the environmentalists, I'd argue that in order to produce the things that people need and want without overutilizing non-sustainable resources like fossil fuels, etc., or polluting the environment, you actually have to do more investment, a more roundabout way to get the energies, such as fossil fuels, or maybe you have to push forward nuclear fusion technology, or something like that, which actually involves more investment. But I think to get back to something a little bit more core, like this brokenness, I'm not sure like what specifically you're referring to about brokenness, but there is a potentially a counter argument that you have to be aware of if you're saying that people need money, is that if people don't understand what's wrong with the economy, in my view of underutilization, then they will tend to think that, which I've seen MM tiers and people on the right say that, well, if you give people money, then you'll just get inflation. You won't get, you won't actually get, more production or improve anybody's situation. You'll just, you'll get inflation, and you'll.
Yeah, this is not an underutilization issue though. This is, basic income isn't just giving people more money. It's deciding how do we want to get, like by what mechanism do we want to get people their money? And there are ways that we do it now, and basic income is an alternative to that. So you could imagine, a world where we're fully utilizing our capacity somehow, and we just have a really crappy money distribution mechanism, and you can propose basic income as a replacement for that, right? So underutilization, yeah, it's a thing, and of course, I think it's hard to have an inefficient money distribution system without also inefficiently using other resources or underutilizing other resources. But it's not about underutilization. And the reason that basic income doesn't cause inflation isn't because there's extra capacity that we can utilize and fill in. That's not why basic income doesn't cause inflation. Basic income doesn't cause inflation because you're setting the basic income at a level that doesn't cause inflation. If you give people too much money, regardless of the mechanism, that causes inflation. If you don't give people enough money, that causes other problems, right? It's about getting the money at the right level. So let's go on to the next quote, which is actually a little bit related. So this is about the Swiss referendum. Asked on basic income, asked why they voted as they did. The reason given most often by yes voters was their desire to promote the discussion of what they thought was a good idea. The most frequent reason given by no voters was their belief that such a basic income could not be financed. So here, I think this is kind of the crux of the basic income debate. No matter what people are saying about it, they're saying it's, unfair, or, all these other arguments related to basic income. They're, anyone who's anti-basic income, they're thinking it's not going to work, right? And they don't understand how it's going to work, and it doesn't fit in with the kind of framework for how we do things now in the economy. So it's really kind of the how do you pay for it question is the question in basic income. And it's a hard question to answer because it's a question that only makes sense in the context of kind of having a budget constraint and taxing and getting money from somewhere, and thinking about like these other social programs, which is like, oh, well, where do we get the money from? That kind of thing. Basic income isn't one of those. Basic income is a solution to the problem of where the economy as a whole gets its money from. And rather than comparing it to welfare programs and stuff like that, you need to be comparing it to monetary policy. You need to be comparing it to, creating jobs and pushing money to, like these other mechanisms that we use to push money into the economy in general. Where does the economy get its money from? So if you're asking, how to finance UBI, you're not thinking about it as the solution to where the economy gets its money from. You're thinking about it as like, oh, we already have all this macroeconomic stuff, all these, economic policies, and there's money in the economy, and we want to make sure that some of it gets to people, and this is kind of an efficient way to do it, or something like that. You're not thinking about basic income the way we often think about it in here. Yeah, go ahead, Joan.
Yeah, what was the actual question that answered?
This is the Swiss referendum on basic income. So the question was, do you support? I think it was a pretty. Let me actually find it. I think it's in the book, page 173. This is North America and France. Swiss population. It just said the text submitted to the vote did not specify an amount, but a very high figure of 2,500 Swiss francs per adult per month was mentioned by the initiators. I don't have the specific text. You can find it online though. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what the yes, I mean, it sounded like two answers that diverged.
Yes is, do you support, would you want a basic income in Switzerland? And no is, or the question is, would you want a basic income in Switzerland, essentially? And yes is, yes, I do want that. And no is,
so
no,
the yes was, we want to talk about it more, and the no was, how do you actually make it happen? More of a practical reaction.
Yeah, the
that's
yes was, we
interesting.
think basic income is a good idea.
Yeah.
We want it to be part of the conversation. The no was, this doesn't make any
Okay.
sense. We can't possibly afford this or finance it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then one more thing, the fact that, I mean, you often talk about the mechanism is what's important, not the outcome. And I don't think, well, by outcome, I mean, what's the philosophy? What's the reason? What, how much do you get? And what purpose does it serve? When you're talking about how does it actually get, people talk about how it gets distributed, but you're talking about how it actually gets into the system in the first place. What's the mechanism? And I don't think most people think of it that way at all. I know I don't. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a tendency among a lot of people to think that, okay, you get the macroeconomics how you want them, and the economy is kind of working, but maybe there's, some inequality or
And you need to
something.
redistribute things. Yeah.
You need to take money from one place and
Right.
and put it
Right.
somewhere else, and there's no macroeconomic effect or something like that. It's just a matter of like deciding how to allocate the money, and the money
Right.
is the money or something like that.
Yeah, and your focus is more on how the money is actually being distributed in the first place. I
Well,
guess you're calling it macroeconomic.
where does the flow of money come from
Yeah.
that goes to consumers?
Right.
And then how is it distributed? Like, what's the distribution of it?
Right.
Basic income is a flat distribution. It goes to everyone equally. Yeah. And yeah, I think, there are other things, like once you've decided that your basic income, is a mechanism you want to use to get people their money, you can ask other questions like, oh, do we want the basic income to be higher? Are there things we can do with fiscal policy, like taxes or adjustments in other places that allow the basic income to be higher, something like that? But I like to start with the low-hanging fruit of, given our current fiscal situation, given all of the government's taxing and spending the way it is now, what's the level of basic income that the economy can sustain that allows us not to use these other silly mechanisms that we use to get people their money, like monetary stimulus and job creation and stuff like that, which are actually tied together because the monetary stimulus is for the purpose of job creation to push money to consumers. So that's essentially kind of my perspective. If you're talking about implementing basic income at like a city level or something like that, you can't really do anything about the macroeconomy. You're too small. So you're really more talking about, you're already at the second step of, okay, what adjustments can we make? What fiscal adjustments can we make elsewhere? Do we want to boost the basic income and stuff like that? That second step is the step that most people are focused on when they're thinking about basic income. They skipped the first step. They skipped the first step of like, what's our default mechanism for getting money to the economy? And they're thinking about, like we could, maybe giving people basic income is a better way to use our money. We have this certain lump of money, and the better way to use it might be basic income than some of these other things that aren't as good, and there's trade-offs, and you're calculating all that stuff. That's the second step. That's after we already have a basic income. Do we want a higher basic income? And then we're at a point where we're starting to make trade-offs like that. Right now, the trade-off is more basic income, less overstimulating the financial markets and less asset bubbles and business cycles and recessions, right? That's hardly a trade-off that anyone would really have any, nobody would want more recessions and more asset bubbles, right? Nobody wants that. So people just aren't thinking about it this way. But that's the low-hanging fruit for basic income, kind of just getting it to that level where you don't have to do this other stuff anymore. So let's go to the next quote here. We're getting into some of these interest groups. Just about keyboard shortcuts to share the screen. Labor unions, that is the organizations of the formal sector's waged workers, have been at the forefront of countless progressive fights and played key roles in major achievements. Can they and will they also play a major role in the path leading up to a basic income? Looking back at most labor union reactions to the earliest basic income-like proposals, this does not seem likely. Yeah, and I think, part of it is that there's an inherent contradiction because basic income undermines labor. It supports people's capacity to have a good life outside of the context of labor, outside of their role as workers. There's also kind of this yin yang thing, right, where the labor market needs evil employers to fight against, otherwise they lose their purpose. Kind of like how, the Joker says that Batman needs him because without him, there's nobody to fight or something like that. Or, some people say police need criminals and criminals need police. I don't know. Nobody said criminals need police, I don't think. But it's that kind of thing. There's this perverse incentive where you have this organization that exists to fight a problem, and without the problem, there's no kind of reason for the organization to exist anymore. And just, it's hard to have a labor movement if what you're fighting for is not related to labor, and it undermines your identity as a group. So they get into a lot of interesting stuff about different labor unions, labor movements in this section. And that includes, some instances of labor unions supporting basic income or trying to support basic income, but invariably kind of comes back to kind of this association with people and work. Like the people are workers, even if they don't have a job and, that kind of thing. They're still trying to fit it into their ideology where it really doesn't fit. It's kind of basic income is antithetical to labor and labor movements and labor unions. Go ahead, Bethany. Bethany, you there?
Hi, sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. I was just saying there are a number of different powerful people and groups that might lose out with the basic income. So like this is related to your last comment, but kind of contrary to your comment a few minutes ago where you said, who wouldn't want things to work more efficiently and like who wouldn't want recession to go away and stuff like this. But as you just talked about, like labor unions might have problems with it because it would hurt their power. And also a lot of people do make a lot of money off of an inflated financial sector. So that's not a trivial like group of people, powerful people that might also have an interest in not having that go away. So, just to point out that like there, maybe the vast majority of people, but there are certain powerful people that would have an interest in against even the low hanging fruit that you're talking about. And small groups of very wealthy, very powerful people often do things or often make things happen that are against the public interest. So I guess not to be discounted.
I think that's true. I also think that none of these people really have a deep understanding of basic income. So they're anyone who's kind of against basic income because they feel it's against their interests, they're against something that's probably not the thing I'm talking about. So I know you're saying, we should imagine that they do understand it and they might still be against it. Yeah, I mean, I think, once you, it really, in order to have such a thing as a labor union or a labor movement, you have to organize around this identity that is maybe not the right thing to be organizing around in the first place. So there's kind of this, you've got this path dependence or this entrenched ideology from a pre-basic income world. I don't know that the members of the labor union are actually going to be worse off in a basic income world, but it does conflict with their ideology. As far as the bankers and the people who are, making a lot of money through asset bubbles, stuff like that, I think it's more true there that a lot of these people are going to, well, there's also the case that, they wouldn't have gotten into that if we were living in a basic income world, but yeah, they have a lot to lose. It's not just a matter of like the pain of having to give up their ideology. Within the labor unions, maybe there are specific people in specific positions of power within the group, and that's where they get their livelihood and all their meaning from and stuff like that. So that's true too. It's not going to be an easy transition, I suppose, is kind of the upshot of all of this. Yeah, do you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna, I think you understood this, but I was gonna say that I don't think the people against it are against it for these reasons right now, but rather that like if you achieved your goal and everybody understood basic income in your terms or like the way that you think about it, then there would be new people who would oppose it for different reasons. I suppose.
In terms of their self-interest, yeah, I think that's true. But I also think it's going to be a lot harder for anyone to be able to justify their position with the public. If everybody kind of
they won't say that it's for the reasons that it is necessarily. Like they'd have some kind of justification or smokescreen, or I mean, we it's unfortunately like people can spin a lot of things and misinform quite a bit as well. So there's always that. Yeah,
if we want to get really conspiracy theory-ish, we could say that, well, maybe, all the people in power do understand basic income the way I do, and they're spreading misinformation. And that's why the basic income movement is making the arguments that they're making and all of that. Annabelle is skeptical. Yeah. I don't think that's the answer. But I do wonder what the world would look like, what our politics would look like if that were the case, if you had, people who kind of, at least the experts and the people who are in power kind of understood basic income as an efficient money distribution mechanism, and then we're trying to convince people that it had these other problems or something. Like, what would that world look like? It's an interesting question.
It's tricky. I mean, a lot of people would have an incentive to support it as well. Like, there'd be a lot of people with incentives on the pro side as well, but there would be some cons. So
yeah. So let's get into the next one here. This is a little bit of a longer one. There is something surprising prima facie about this unsympathetic reaction. How could the workers' movement be opposed to a measure that increases workers' bargaining power? An unconditional basic income would not only increase workers' options in and out of employment and thereby enable them to individually negotiate higher pay or better work conditions, it would also provide a convenient strike fund and hence a valuable resource for collective action, as workers would keep receiving secure basic incomes while the payment of their wages is interrupted by work stoppage. Strikers would thereby gain the ability to face long-lasting resistance from employers. A basic income would also reduce the supply of labor for at least some types of jobs, thereby strengthening the bargaining position of unions as collective actors in the labor market. So I think there are a lot of basic income supporters who kind of feel this way. Like, why would, people who are standing up for, the poor or the disadvantaged be against something like basic income? And I think it's related to kind of all the stuff I was just saying just now, that there's no role for labor as an ideology anymore in a basic income world. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
So one thing to make it really topical, like I'm wondering how you would respond to people who would say that the labor shortages right now, I don't necessarily fully agree with this, but what would you say to people who said that the labor shortages right now suggested that we didn't have room for something like a basic income?
Yeah, that's a good question, both of you. I think, well, the first thing I would say is that part of the reason we're having labor shortages right now is because, at least in the United States, we were supporting people through unemployment insurance. So we were punishing people for going back and getting jobs. Basic income, of course, doesn't do that. But I would also say that if you set the basic income too high, then yeah, you are going to have labor shortages and you're going to have inflation. It's going to drive up the price of consumer goods because otherwise they just run out on the shelves and that kind of stuff. You have inflation until it brings the basic income back down to a level you can handle. So there's two things to talk about here. One is kind of this work conditionality. This you are looking for a job and you're unemployed and we'll give you money because, we want to provide you insurance in the in-between times. That's what we were kind of doing. So nobody wanted to go back to work. If the insurance is better than the work itself, nobody wants to go back. So that's a big part of what we saw. But it's also true that, if you give people too much money outside of jobs, then not enough people are going to work and you're going to have a labor shortage. Another way of describing a labor shortage is that people are unwilling to work at the wages that you're offering, right? If you wanted to pay people more, of course, you could get them to work, but there's a little bit of a lag. So you have to kind of wait for, okay, we got to hire more people. That means we have to raise our prices and pay higher wages or something like that. So it's, I guess that would be my response.
Yeah, I think one other thing that's going on right now that I see is oh,
All right, I'm going to go ahead and
sorry, I'm back. One
Okay.
of the other things that's happening right now is that the employers also know that it is temporary, and so they're not raising wages. That's something else that I've heard anecdotally, at least, like that it's not allowed really to raise wages a lot of the time, even when you're facing an employee shortage in like a bigger company, presumably because they know that people's unemployment is going to run out and then they can get them at the same wage, so they don't want to set the precedent of raising wages. So all of this is to say, like, there are a lot of details about how a basic income would be rolled out that are important. One of them is gradually, so that you don't have like these big shocks. And another one is that, like, you've often talked about how wages might have to increase and decrease in different places in the economy, even if we were stopping overall inflation. And I suspect that a lot of the jobs that are seeing shortages are ones where you might have to see wage increases, at least from what I read about these jobs and like the bad conditions and how unhappy people are and like the low wages and the bad hours. It's like, it seems like even a small amount of basic income in these particular fields would create pressure on the wages, but you're not seeing that adjustment happening because it's a known temporary thing. So I don't know, that's just another thought that I had about that.
yeah, I think that's a fair point. If people are waiting for the benefits to expire and they're expecting things to kind of go back to normal, I think to some extent, some people saw, what it was like not having to work those jobs, and they're trying to figure out a way to kind of continue that. Obviously, it's hard to continue if you lose the unemployment insurance, but I think there are people who are trying. So that creates some hysteresis there, at least. I think one other thing to kind of note is that there's such a thing as a business having a labor shortage, or lots of businesses having a labor shortage, without the economy as a whole having a labor shortage. Like, what if these are businesses that just don't need to exist, right? The businesses that can't find the workers, what if they go out of business? People shop somewhere else. Maybe there are some that are really kind of important for the economy, but maybe also not, because we were doing a lot of economic policy to keep these businesses going and to keep them employing people and that kind of thing. So a labor shortage, in terms of what's ostensibly a labor shortage, might not actually be a problem for the economy if you're going through a transition to something better.
I guess this is what gets into some of the details about what you think a problem is, because like the ones that I'm thinking of are, like cafes and restaurants and stuff. And you could say like, well, we don't technically need those, but I mean, people were benefiting from them. So for right now, like several times, it's not the end of the world, but several times I've shown up somewhere hungry and it's like, oh, we're closed on this day, or like, oh, we're closing at these hours now because we don't have people. So there is that, like, that's bad for the consumer, but a lot of things are bad for the consumer. So I guess my point is, like, even though you, in the big picture, you can make certain statements about life with the basic income, like you would see either these kinds of things or maybe inflation of prices for the consumer in certain areas. And I guess if you're keeping the overall price level stable, you'd see decreases in prices in other areas. But I think, you definitely would see, it wouldn't be like there would be no effect on everything, right? There would be shuffling around of prices or available services or some combination of the two. And I'm sure a lot of people would be, happy obviously about some of those things, and then like maybe very unhappy about others of them that are an inconvenience or a disappointment or whatever.
Yeah, and in terms of your specific example, maybe that's an opportunity for someone to make an app that really does a good job of keeping track of what's open or what's not. And you need your coffee every day. It'll tell you where to go or something like that. So you go to the places that are open. It's not necessarily that much of a hit on the consumer for businesses to be open only a few days a week, as long as they're not all closed on the same days or something like that. So I don't know. Yeah, you're right. It is complicated, though. There are kind of frictions and various things. But again, this is also pretty far afield from basic income. Basic income is not a form of insurance. It's not something you lose if you get a job. So it's not punishing people who get jobs.
No, but
in
I'm
the same
just
way.
I'm assuming that some amount of basic income, like, you would have an effect. I mean, I know some of this is the unemployment. The way that unemployment works is definitely magnifying it, but I'm assuming that some degree of basic income, especially the amounts that you think we could likely afford as an economy, would have some similar consequences for some of these industries. It seems like they would, because I mean, I don't know for sure, but from what I've heard, it's or some consequence. I mean, maybe the conditions would improve, or like people would work like small amounts of time at these kinds of places for like whatever. I'm not really sure what would happen, but things would likely change. And this is just one industry, but there are probably lots of industries where things would change in one direction or another. So there's quite a lot of adjusting that would probably need to happen.
So I think something to keep in mind is that the introduction of basic income is going to destroy a lot of businesses, and not necessarily through the mechanism of there being a labor shortage. It can be through the mechanism of, oh, now interest rates are higher and we can't roll over our funding, that kind of thing. And then all those people are going to lose their jobs too. So maybe some of those people will want to go work in cafes. I don't know. Maybe some people would love that kind of job if they could afford it. Like a lot of people, there are a lot of jobs that people want that they don't work because they just don't pay enough. But maybe you like talking to people and giving them coffee or something like that. So it's hard to say, like how this would affect specifically the cafe situation or kind of in general. I mean, there are guesses we can have about certain things and general trends and stuff like that. But I think what you said before is right, that you've got to introduce it gradually. Certainly the pandemic was not gradual, it was very sudden, and the adjustments we had to make were very sudden as well.
Yeah, and there was a massive decrease in demand for these services too, and then like that went back up. So yeah, there are a lot of weird things, but I guess I'm just pointing out that hidden behind this idea of keeping the price level stable or something in aggregate, you have like these different effects on prices that are shifting around because of this big dramatic change, or maybe you do it gradually and it's not so dramatic, but doing it gradually makes a big difference, I think, because then companies can also, and consumers both, can kind of adjust gradually to the changes and it doesn't bother anybody quite as much.
Yeah, and I like to ask two different questions. One question is, what does a world with basic income look like? How does it operate? That kind of thing. And then another question is, what does the transition from our world into a world with basic income look like? And that's a lot more complicated to answer than just the question of what does a world with basic income look like, in terms of just kind of all the different factors involved. So yeah, got to do it gradually. So let's get into the next quote here. It is analogous to what John Maynard Keynes saw as the main reason for the British trade unions' opposition to universal child benefits. I believe, this is John Maynard Keynes, I believe that the trade union movement is actively hostile on the express ground that it fears such allowances would be what I wish them to be, namely an alternative to higher wages. It would be much better than a man with heavy family burdens to support. It would be much better that a man with heavy family burdens to support should receive assistance out of taxation, which is thrown on profits generally, than that an attempt should be made to raise wages paid by his employer to a disproportionate level. So the question here is, I mean, obviously he's talking about coming from taxes, and I don't necessarily think about it that way, but the question here is, do we really want people to be dependent on private employers for their income? And to what extent? And Keynes is calling that into question. Like, is higher wages really what we want, or do we want higher incomes? And do we want to minimize the extent to which people have to depend on employers for their incomes? And I think that's right. Something I like to say sometimes is that wages are coercive, and you want to minimize wages. You want to keep them only as large as necessary to pull people into labor, and you want the rest of people's income to be coming from somewhere else. I would say probably a basic income. This is from an article that he wrote in 1930 called "The Question of High Wages." So there's another Keynes quote here that I wanted to get to. I think we have time for just one more of these. Oh yeah, here we go. Keynes saw it as a great misfortune that the self-conscious efforts of the working class to better themselves should be so much concentrated on the effort to raise wages, even to the point of being suspicious, as I fancy the trade unions are of alternative methods of bettering conditions. So yeah, I think, this is something we still suffer from today. He was writing in 1930, but people are always just fighting for minimum wage. And if there's something that's an alternative to minimum wage, it's seen as a threat to the fight for a higher minimum wage. If there's something that's seen as an alternative to, something that's good for workers, it's seen as a threat to workers, even though workers are people and you're doing things that are good for people if you have a basic income. So yeah, there's more in this chapter. He gets into employers, how employers think about basic income, then the precariat, which is just kind of unemployed people, underemployed people, poor people who just are in a precarious living situation. This is a term that I think was coined by Guy Standing. And then he talks about women. Oh, let's do this one as our final quote. It's in the feminism section. Mhm. There is a crucial distinction between reforms that lead to reduced participation by women in labor markets as a result of reduced freedom and reforms that yield reduced participation thanks to increased freedom. A regression from a universal to a means-tested scheme of child benefits falls into the first category. As explained in Chapter 6, it amounts to increasing the rate at which mothers' earnings are taxed and thereby creates, for many of them, a household trap. By contrast, if women choose to reduce their paid work as a result of basic income being introduced, that would be due to their greater freedom, to their greater bargaining power gained as a result, and to their own choices of how to use it. Realizing the importance of this distinction is essential to the defense of basic income from a feminist perspective, right? So a lot of people, during especially the kind of the second wave of feminism, women were entering the workforce, and they were doing that because they were gaining freedom, right? If you give them more freedom still and give them money, and they choose to leave the workforce, that's not necessarily a regression to a worse state of the world. It's, oh, well, now they not only don't have to, they're not only free to earn money, independently, they're also free to have money and not have to do it in a way that's dependent on an employer. And that's better. And, you might see that. You might see women and men kind of leaving the workforce or working less, and that's not a sign of anything bad happening. So you have to kind of pay attention to, like, if what you're looking at is, if the only statistic you're looking at is, well, how many women are employed, and you want to get it up to equal to the level of men, and that's what you're paying attention to, then basic income might look like a threat to you, but you're paying attention to the wrong statistic, or you're paying attention to it in the wrong way. So yeah, there's most of this chapter is just kind of historical examples of when one group supported basic income, or one type of group supported basic income or not. Yeah, the overall conclusion is just that we have a long way to go politically. And I think I agree with that. I think we have a long way to go on the theoretical intellectual side as well. And the idea that they kind of finish on is kind of sneaking in through the back door, having a participation income, which is ostensibly for the purpose of, providing people money for more general benefits than what you would normally think of in the labor market. Yeah. So, can we kind of find our way to a basic income without fully understanding it, and without fully politically supporting it? And then once it's in place, that can help us understand the benefits, maybe a little bit. So anyway, there's one more chapter of the book. We're talking about it next week. And the title of the chapter is Viable in the Global Era, Multi-Level Basic Income. So they're going to get into, we live in a global economy. What does that look like from a basic income perspective, and what opportunities are there and what challenges are there for the global perspective? So thanks, everybody. That's it for today.